Good morning, everybody, and thank you for waiting a few moments while we got the screen view up. Hopefully you can see me and hear me. My name is Andrew Rubin, and I'm the CEO of Cymtec. Thanks for joining us for the continuation of our webinar series for 2011. And as the invitation mentioned, we're going to be talking today about financial services and the problems of having a limited IT staff. But of course, we're going to bring it back to our core message that we talk about at Cymtec every day, which is how do you manage remote and branch office networks when you have limited resources, limited budget, and often the same problems in those sites as you do in all of your other sites, including your biggest site back home. And so as we dive into this presentation and we start looking at some of the issues that IT departments are facing nowadays, what we find is that there are many, many challenges that IT is faced with. And these challenges really range from how to deal with the network all the way through to how to ensure the end user has a solid performance, has the things that they need and the tools that they need on a regular basis. So from an IT perspective, obviously the first issue that they deal with, and this is something that happens every day in every organization, is the operational complexity of the environment. Every industry, and in particular industries like financial services, are dealing with greater demands for more applications, more services, and of course the problem that we're all familiar with, which is more devices. What happens every year after the holidays? We're all familiar now with the January scenario of people coming in with their newest toys and the newest gadgets and realizing very quickly that as IT, we're not being asked any longer whether or not we can support these things. We're being told that we must support them. So as we grow the complexity of the type of devices, the type of things that we're trying to access, and the places that we can access them from, obviously it's creating a huge strain on the IT department. We're also finding that more globally distributed locations, employees, and customers is causing this issue of a proliferation of endpoints and a proliferation of geographies in which these endpoints exist. In other words, business is global nowadays. What we find is that, when there's a soft economy in one place, people go and chase business in others. Now, years ago, that never used to be the case because it was so expensive and it was so difficult to go try and find business in places like Asia or maybe even Europe. But now it's a global world, it's a global economy, and it's very easy to say I'm going to open a remote office in a faraway city or a faraway country, and I'm only going to have one employee there, but that one employee needs complete IT support. We're also finding, as we move down the page, that things like application performance and availability are becoming absolute requirements. There was a time just a few years back where if something wasn't working or an end user sat down and tried to access something, if it didn't appear right away, that was considered all right. It wasn't a problem that an application may have taken 5 or 10 minutes to start up, or even for that matter, a PC may have taken 2 or 3 minutes to boot up. Obviously, those days are over. The demand of instantaneous gratification or instantaneous satisfaction are 100% pervasive through almost every organization. And when we bring it back to something like financial services, where the difference in something getting done in 5 seconds versus 5 minutes could be a trade that's worth millions of dollars, application performance and availability is an absolute. We look at things like higher bandwidth costs, and of course, to some extent, that's a counterintuitive point. We all think of bandwidth as something that's getting bigger and cheaper every day, and to a large extent, that's true in places like the U.S. But as you open these global offices, let's say you put an office in a place in Southeast Asia, for instance, like Vietnam, a developing economy, what you find is that not only is that not true, but it's incredibly difficult and remarkably expensive to provision any bandwidth, let alone the type of bandwidth that we hope and expect to have here in a place like the U.S. So it's not that easy to push very heavy applications out all over the place. And as we centralize things and put them in the cloud, the network becomes your primary transport to access your core applications. If that network is either thin or expensive, managing it becomes much more important. Obviously, the side effect, so to speak, of having all of this distribution is that what you're going to find is that you have a much more vulnerable architecture. And one of the things that we talk about all the time, we put kind of the running joke tagline of how many different phones does one IT department have to support, and that, of course, is very true, but also makes the point that there's just a huge proliferation of devices. But take it a step further and think about it from this standpoint, and maybe we can bring in the regulatory and compliance requirement bullet as well. If you push out a critical application that you used to have on an actual server sitting inside of your data center or even inside of your office, And then one day you flip a light switch, and all of a sudden this application lives in someone else's environment. Let's call it the cloud, which means it's really not your data center. It's not even your environment anymore. How do you make sure that the environment that you just push that critical application to is as secure and is as compliant as the environment that you control every day? This is one of those questions that people are starting to ask all the time. I've put things out in the cloud that are literally the core information, application, and data that I run my business off of, but I've never gone and seen the data center where it sits. I don't know what layers of protection or information or visibility these people have into their infrastructure. And so when you look at it both in terms of the vulnerability of that, and then, of course, bring in the compliance requirements, how do I report on something that I don't have any visibility into, but beyond that, I don't have any control over? What it all adds up to is that we've got this major blind spot that's being created in these remote and branch offices. And for an industry like financial services, that blind spot can be both very dangerous and very expensive given the regulatory and compliance environment that, they live within. And, of course, last but not least, this comes back to the opening bullet, which is bigger workload, smaller staff. The reality is that the economy obviously has been shaky. It was incredibly difficult for a few years. We had what appears to be a very nice recovery over the last year or so. But even in the last few weeks, what we're finding is that there really is a change, and that change has come very quickly. There's a change in the attitude, and there's even a change in the market itself. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we're constantly planning for bigger workloads, more requirements, but doing it with a smaller staff, smaller resource, smaller budget. And as we go into the product section of this presentation, what you're going to find is that that's a big piece of the Century message. Obviously, this slide just illustrates something that we talk about every day. Cloud computing, something that is obviously a very common trend and a huge piece of every IT department's conversation today. There is a huge value proposition there. But what does it do to your network? What demands does it introduce? Because you now have to use your network to access your critical applications. What are the compliance and the vulnerability implications of putting these things outside, as we said a moment ago? So really what it comes down to is how do you balance an incredible initiative that's obviously taking over every facet of IT in a lot of ways, but still maintain what you need in terms of operational control and compliance, visibility, and reporting while balancing these things out. So what are some of the goals? And, these goals flow directly from the challenges, which is, of course, the way it should be. Find a pain point, and then what's the goal? Solve the pain point. So number one, let's reduce IT costs. Let's find ways to do more with less. Number two, let's ensure that the customer and the employee productivity and experience is where it needs to be. Back to that point about ensuring performance, ensuring application delivery. Let's make sure beyond that we're not just delivering the ability to use these things, but that we're protecting our infrastructure, which is the piece that we do control, but also our information, which we may or may not control depending on where it lives. So how do we make sure that our internal infrastructure is safe, protected? How do we make sure that the data, which may be customers' data or company reputational data, is protected? And how do we make sure that as we push things into the cloud or into other people's data centers, that we're in a position to really, truly have visibility, reporting, and information about what's happening to our data somewhere else? Obviously, speeding up application delivery is always going to be one of these requirements that IT is going to be forced to deal with. And it will not matter where the requirement is coming from. If you're a financial services firm, it could be the trading desk. It could be the CFO who needs better access to information, some of which is on a local server, some of which is stored in the cloud. But the bottom line is that what we need to be able to do from an overarching theme is we need to be able to say, how do we deliver reliably? How do we speed up new applications and services as we introduce them to the environment, and do all this while maintaining the visibility, the control, and the compliance reporting that we need as an IT department in order to do our jobs. And so we look at trying to gather all these things up, and we really view it as a number of different challenges that all kind of come together. The first one is you must have visibility in order to do these things. Anybody who has ever tried to make a decision about virtually anything will tell you that when it comes to IT specifically, the more information you have, the better the decision-making process is. The second thing is that you need to be able to take that information, look at that visibility, and understand what am I trying to control as a result of it. So if I have a performance issue on my network, is that as a result of something being misconfigured, Is it as a result of something that an end user is doing, an application or a file that they're trying to download or access? Or is it as a result of the fact that the pipe that I've had for the last 3 years is simply too thin now to support my new environment? The balancing act of being able to see all these perspectives and then using that information to set up controls, to look at what can I tweak, what can I change that will solve this problem. And then, of course, balancing all of that against the reporting requirements. These are the types of issues that really wrap into, if we can deal with these problems, this will give our end users what they need while making it so that we're performing and we're managing in a way that from an IT standpoint delivers for the organization. So let's dive in with that theme and those overarching goals in mind. Let's dive into Sentry, which is really a tool that was developed for network visibility, application and network optimization, and protection. And, of course, all of this is overlaid with the reporting necessary to see and understand what's happening. One of the things that we hear very often from customers and prospects that look and use our product is that Sentry has a very unique combination. Most products come in, and the bulk, if not the entire product story, really revolves around what it does, the functionality. What is it that this product will deliver for me? And certainly that's a core part of our story like it is any other products. But when it comes to Sentry, and you look at remote branch and small offices, if you don't deal with the product architecture and the price issues right up front, almost on level par with the functionality itself, you tend to miss a very important part of the story. And the best example that I can give to show the balancing act necessary to looking at functionality, architecture, and price would be something that a customer said to us when we first introduced the product. This customer had been struggling with approximately 50 remote offices. They had been struggling with everything from phone calls from end users complaining about application performance, things like why is the internet taking too long to load today, but yesterday it was fine, and then occasionally the spyware malware outbreak that started on just one laptop and somehow managed to swim its way through the network to 20 offices before anybody even realized it was there. So they were living the pain of the remote branch small office network challenge. And one of the things that they said to us is, we've looked at many products that can help us functionally solve some of these problems. There are incredible visibility tools in the market. There have been for years. There's certainly many, many different layers of security, even some that specifically address things like spyware and malware outbreak. The problem really came for this customer from a couple of perspectives. The first one is that these products are typically architected to sit in a data center or in a very large office back home, which of course immediately brings you to problem number two, which is they're priced for a data center or a very large office back home. So what this customer said to us was, it's not a functionality challenge. If we could literally put anything we want in every remote office and money was free, we could solve these problems. The challenge that we're facing with 50 of these remote offices is, how do we deliver something into every one of our sites that's consistent, that gives us a solution across the entire organization, do it at a price point that makes sense from an ROI standpoint, and do it in such a way that we're not introducing more complexity or risk into our network while getting this functionality pushed out to these remote offices. And that's a really interesting balancing act, and that's why you see right out of the gate we lead with functionality, architecture, and price. So with that said, let's talk about where the product goes. So we ask questions like this. What if you had real-time visibility and trending analysis of your branch office traffic? What if you could see where your bandwidth is going within that local network inside of a branch site, or better yet, inside of all of your branch offices? What if you could easily troubleshoot your branch office networks and you could fix problems when people call up and say things like things are running slowly because you suddenly had real visibility, not just real-time but historical as well? What if you could ensure performance for all of your critical business applications? Again, if you can't see what's happening and what's causing bottlenecks, you can't possibly fix them without taking a lot of time and a lot of effort, most of which will be useless, trying to stab things in the dark. That's not a way to troubleshoot. It'll get the job done, but it's wildly inefficient. What if you could continue to load new applications on remote networks, remote offices, but understand the actual impact before you flip the light switch? So one of the things that we hear all the time is, I'm getting pressure to put more and more tools and more applications in my environment, but at some point I know the network is going to roll over on itself. So what if you had the visibility and the information to be able to prevent that moment from taking place? And of course, all of this comes back to the overarching theme, which is, what if we could increase the productivity of the remote office, the remote workforce, but not do it by making IT's life more miserable? Actually do it by reducing IT support costs and reducing the load on the IT support department. So why can't we do these things today? I mean, all these devices exist in a network. Obviously, this is a list of very commonly found devices and niche solutions. Many of the organizations out there have some or all of these things already, but it comes back to the problem that I spoke about a moment ago. Lots of different endpoints. There's no doubt about it that we're looking at having to optimize different, very mutually exclusive tools and objectives, and so it's very hard to get to that 1 + 1 = 4. We're going to argue that if you have the right functionality at the right price point in the right architecture, that's how you get 1 + 1 + 1 to not equal 3, but to equal 5, 10, 20. So there's a lot of unrealized ROI because you've got overlapping products. You have some pieces that you need from one and others from another, and the time that it takes to both install, manage, and use these different point solutions is a big drain on the organization. It's also very hard manually to put a picture together that's cohesive. So we look at a picture that really looks more like this. And this picture really is a perfect example of how you can have all the right solutions in place. You can have all the right layers of infrastructure in place. But when you start introducing all the pieces in the middle, security, alerting, performance, cloud applications, suddenly VoIP, how you bring all these pieces together and how you get one picture and one management tool from back home, that's where the problem really ends up occurring. So what we tried to do when we built Sentry is we tried to say, how can we unleash the ROI of a distributed network? How can we give IT the ability to take control from back home of both a security, a visibility, and a performance picture from one place? How do we gain visibility, and how do we quickly adapt by using that visibility to change the environment, to change the network, and to plan for what may be coming down the road? And to a large extent, it's not a story of inventing a new functionality category or a new feature that never existed. It's about packaging it up the right way, delivering it at the right price point, and bringing it to a part of the environment that needs the same things as the environment back home at headquarters or in the data center, but delivering it in a package that was built, designed, and priced for that remote branch or small office. So what do we do from a value standpoint? Well, obviously, some of these things are going to flow right out of the presentation thus far. Obviously, maximizing application performance. And I'm not going to go through every one of these bullets, but as you scroll down the page, some of these things are real, actual challenges that are based on a specific technology. How do we allocate bandwidth to things like VoIP, trading, teller, CRM, ERP? But if we look at some of the overarching themes, we talk about minimizing downtime. Obviously, as we talked about before, protecting infrastructure and information. And when we bring this all back to financial services, although so many of these themes are consistent across literally every single industry, financial services has that very unique pain point of having to deal with all these issues magnified tremendously. So back to the example of the trade that doesn't execute costing millions of dollars. The one compliance report that isn't available when necessary being a huge problem as opposed to just an internal problem. So what we've tried to do is look at, can we deliver the value proposition of an IT tool as well as a compliance reporting tool, as well as a control mechanism for the environment, which could help with everything from IT to HR. And how do we do it most importantly in the lowest TCO, the quickest ROI, really bring this functionality into these environments at a low enough price point that it can get there quickly, and help IT day to day from that moment forward. So here are some of the key capabilities, and these next couple of slides as we move our way through the finish of the presentation really get into the nuts and bolts of the solution. So number one, this is really primarily delivered through traffic visibility. You need to be able to measure, diagnose, and monitor where your bandwidth is going, which users are using it, and what they're using it for. So we really deliver this through a few tools. Number one, traffic analysis. The ability to diagnose and repair remotely the problems that occur in these remote offices. And we do this through two real visible screenshots, which I'm going to show you here in just a moment. Packet capture, which is exactly what it sounds like. The ability to go in and say, I need this device to do a capture, grab some information about the traffic on a particular part of my network, let's say one of my remote offices, analyze it, and give me some statistics in real time about what's happening. And then, of course, the secondary product there is what happens if you're not interested in looking at just this moment in time, but you want to be able to see a historical view. What if somebody calls up and says, I'm having a problem using the Internet right now? And the first question that we all ask as IT is, when did it start? And the next question, or the next thing that you hear from your end user is, it started yesterday. And of course, as an IT person, that's incredibly frustrating because you wanted that phone call yesterday when it started, but that's not the way the world works. So what the historical view gives you is the ability to go backwards. It allows you to say, you know what, I know something changed around 3 o'clock yesterday because that's what my end user told me. Now I can go back and I can look at that information and I can see that based on what I'm seeing between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock yesterday, something did change. And by the way, this is what it was. And I can then make decisions about how to control and enforce based on that, which of course brings us to number 2. The control and enforce mechanisms are incredibly simple. It's really 2 things. Number 1, what users do. So the ability to filter what they can access on the web and the applications that they have access to. And number 2, the ability to set up bandwidth shaping or quality of service to ensure that applications that need or deserve bandwidth in a specially unique way can get it. So what we've said is control and enforcement is as much about promoting the good as it is about reducing the bad. One of the challenges that every one of our customers talks about regularly is that a few years back, you could block access to things like Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, and you'd be able to say, you know what, I'm shutting these things off because they're inappropriate at work. And nowadays, although there are still certain things that are very inappropriate, we find a lot of customers still blocking pornography, blocking violence, blocking gambling, but all those other things, those are all business tools. It's no longer social media to be on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook during the day because most customers are using those as actual ways to promote or manage their own businesses. So it's impossible to go to your end user community and say, I'm shutting off YouTube, but at the same time, we're posting our user manuals and our employee training videos on YouTube. So the ability to promote what's important and eliminate the things that don't need to be there, that's really what we're talking about with control and enforcement. And of course, last but not least, when we look at protection and containment, especially in the remote office environment, what we're really looking at is essentially how do I not only protect my environment from getting infected, but more importantly, how do I prevent an infection that may slip by from spreading through my entire environment? Everybody nowadays accepts the fact that at a certain point in time, something's going to get infected. It's going to happen. A laptop's going to get brought home, it's going to come back, and it's going to have spyware on it. The bigger question is, once one machine's infected, how quickly do I find it, eliminate it, and if it does start spreading, how quickly do I stop it? And that's really where a lot of this comes in. So when we look at things like the traffic analysis, looking at the graph on the left where what we're doing is we're essentially saying how much data by port is being consumed in a particular site right now, graphing it so that you can see it easily, and then showing you the data below and allowing you to dig into it. On the right, looking at things like what is my total traffic volume in bytes for all traffic. So the ability to actually look at that line and see where are my spikes. And these particular graphs are available in Sentry going back as far as a full 7 days. So when we think about troubleshooting traffic and network bottlenecks, what we find is that very often, even a day or two of history is invaluable. Being able to go back an entire week allows you to dig in a level of detail and into a level of history that very often is a complete blind spot for our customers. We also obviously talk about reporting, and this really brings the compliance piece into the story. How do we make sure that we go about really truly delivering reporting that can be used both internally to manage what end users do and the threats to the network, as well as the compliance component that may come from something like PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley, or HIPAA. And these reports, just 2 examples of them here, really focus on the user activity as well as the threat activity within the network environment. And of course, last but not least, in terms of the final piece of the story, how do I manage all this? So you can envision the scenario where you've got 50 of these appliances out like this customer, and one of the issues that you have very often is, where do I go to manage it all? I don't have time during the day to go to 50 different places in order to change a rule or look for a particular piece of information. So one of the core value props of Sentry is that it has centralized management. The ability to run a software application back home that essentially ties together everything into a single dashboard. The ability to do everything from review your information, see your events, review and manage your reporting infrastructure, change, configure your policy over time, and even integrate with Active Directory or LDAP so that you're managing these things based on usernames, not IP addresses. All of this is provided through the central management console. So what this allows you to do is it really gives you that central point to tie everything back to. And that's a key feature because one of the things that we hear, back to the beginning of the Century story, it's not about the functionality. That exists. It's been out there for quite some time. It's about the packaging, the ease of use, and the price point delivery. And so centralized management is a requirement, not a nicety, if you're really going to manage a distributed environment. This picture really brings that story together. As you can imagine, if you're the company on the left and you've got that central headquarters, a corporate WAN, and then 3 branch offices down below, on the right side what you have is you've got your branch office in the bottom and you've got your corporate headquarters in the top. And the beauty of Century is that it's so simple. You have essentially an appliance that sits in these locations. It sits in a completely transparent way to the network. It's not in any way, shape, or form requiring a reconfiguration or a routing or traffic change to the network. So it inserts very easily. It's incredibly safe in that it fails to a completely open state. So this is something that you can introduce without having to worry about if this particular product fails, does my network get taken down? But what it does is it gives you that localized visibility and control, tying everything back to that dashboard back home. And that's really what the picture is demonstrating, is that you really can deploy something like this in a distributed way as opposed to trying to bring everything back home and manage it from one point. And last but not least, we talk very openly about pricing being a critical part of the story. And, this is the point where most vendors would have cut off because pricing is always a very touchy subject when you're trying to sell a distributed product. It's easy if you're selling one appliance into one data center, and then it just becomes an issue of the number itself. Pricing when you're selling a remote branch and distributed product is fundamental to the story because no matter how great the product functionality is and how perfect the architecture is, price times 50 locations becomes a core part of the conversation very early on. So the way that we solve the pricing problem is really by doing 2 simple things. Number one, we broke the market for remote and branch offices into 2 very logical places. The truly small office, 25 users or less, and everything else. And everything else could be 26 users, but it could also be 500 users in a remote site. But by building an appliance line that allowed us to have what we refer to as a SOHO or an NT25, the 1 to 25 user appliance, truly the desktop unit, very much like we think of a Linksys sitting at home, a unit that's designed for that small home office environment. It allowed us to do 2 things. It brought a product to market that fits that environment. Can't imagine how many times somebody doesn't even have a telco rack, let alone a cabinet in the closet. So this is a form factor that you could sit on top of a PC, sitting inside of what may be just a cubicle somewhere. But it also allowed us to deliver a price point that made it economical. So although the price isn't on here, we're going to share it. Our 1 to 25 user appliance, which is a bundled package that includes the hardware, the maintenance, the licensing, essentially the entire product, even the warranty for the first year, is a $2,400 price point. And that allows us to really go in and say, for $2,400, we can deliver an entire bundle for your first 12 months of operation that gives you all this visibility, all the control, all your updates, your safety, your warranty, and it does it at a budgetable number that if you've got 25 users, especially in a vertical like financial services, where one user going down could be a lot more expensive than $2,400, this gives you the ability to create an ROI and a business case for buying this product. And then from there, obviously, like every other product, we want the ability to scale into the bigger environments. So we have both a 1U rack mount and even a 2U rack mount appliance. It has a more standard pricing model of buying a piece of hardware up front as a one-time cost and then maintenance and licensing on a recurring basis. And although there's some scale in the numbers, so it would be difficult to go through every version or every iteration, one of the examples that we give is that for somewhere in the area of about $7,000, we can deliver this entire package into a 100-user environment. And so the point that we're trying to make is really 2 things. One, it's a simple pricing model. And 2, that in particular in the small office under 25 users, it's incredibly cost effective, especially in a vertical where the loss could be so immediate, so real, and so quick. And so with that story, although obviously that's a lot of information in a short period of time, hopefully it gives some perspective as to the challenges that IT in general is facing and certainly specific to financial services, a little bit of an overview on our product. And as always, we really welcome and encourage questions, feedback. but we're very sensitive to time, and given that I know we started a few minutes late, but we're bumping right up against 30 minutes, I'd like to really thank you for taking the time to join today. This is an ongoing webinar series that we're going to be conducting throughout the rest of the year, so please look for the future invites, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.